I'm Ethan Harper, and I left Nashville to come to Willow Creek, Tennessee, a remote place amidst vast grasslands. I was sick of noisy neighbors, cramped driveways, and that stupid HOA forcing me to paint my house the color they chose. I wanted a fresh start, peaceful, no rules, just me, my old pickup truck, and the 10 acres of land I'd just bought. I built a simple wooden house, standing in the middle of a field looking out to the horizon, thinking I'd finally escaped the drama. No more complaints, no ridiculous regulations, just wide open space and the quiet I'd always dreamed of. The first day I drove back, I laughed out loud as I parked on the red dirt road leading to my house. This was my private driveway, my personal property, no one else's business. I imagined days without disturbance, hearing only the wind instead of car horns, seeing only green grass instead of concrete fences. Willow Creek was everything I wanted: freedom, tranquility, and not a single HOA in sight, or so I thought. I shut the truck door, stepped onto my porch, feeling like I'd just found my own personal paradise. But little did I know, even in this middle of nowhere spot, trouble would still find me. I was wrong to think moving far away would be enough to cut off the old chaos. Just a few days later, I discovered that no matter where I ran, there'd still be someone like Margaret Wheeler, a woman from the local HOA, ready to turn my peaceful dream into a nightmare. I didn't realize it then, but shutting that truck door that night was the start of a fight I never wanted. And it came faster than I thought, right on the very driveway I'd assumed was mine alone. I'd only parked my pickup truck on the red dirt road leading to my house in Willow Creek for a few days, when trouble knocked, or rather, marched right onto my land. I was unloading stuff from the truck bed when I heard the crunch of shoes on gravel. Looking up, I saw a middle-aged woman, stiff as if she'd just stepped out of a tax office. Margaret Wheeler, she introduced herself, holding a clipboard, her sharp eyes scanning my truck like she was inspecting inventory. "This road is for residents only," she snapped, her voice cutting like a knife. "You can't drive on it like it's your personal highway." I raised an eyebrow, trying not to laugh. "I live here," I replied, pointing to the wooden house a few yards away. "This is my driveway, my private property, nothing to do with anyone else." But Margaret didn't flinch. Her lips pressed into a thin line, the kind of tight-lipped look I figured had been etched there from years of nagging. "All roads in this community are under the jurisdiction of the Willow Creek HOA, she declared, tapping her pen on the clipboard like a judge with a gavel. "You need to submit a request to use it, like everyone else." I stood there, still holding a box, staring at her like she'd just spoken Martian. A request to use my own road. I let out a short laugh, thinking she must be joking. "This road was built by the previous owner. It's part of the land I bought. Your HOA has no say here." But Margaret didn't laugh. She just stared at me, eyes blazing, and said, "That's not what our community guidelines say. If you don't comply, we'll have to take stronger measures." She turned on her heel, leaving me standing there, dumbfounded and annoyed. I slammed the truck door shut, muttering, "Welcome to paradise, Ethan." I'd thought I'd escaped petty control games when I left Nashville, but no, Margaret Wheeler clearly had other plans. After that run-in with Margaret Wheeler on my driveway, I knew she wasn't the type to back off. The way she tapped her pen on that clipboard, the cold glare that seemed to bore right through me, it wasn't just some cranky old lady. I decided to dig into who I was dealing with, and what I dug up from old George, my neighbor half a mile down the road, chilled me to the bone. Margaret wasn't just an HOA member, she was the self-appointed queen of Willow Creek, and she had her own reasons for turning my life into hell. Margaret Wheeler, 58, used to be a tax worker in Knoxville before retiring and moving here 10 years ago. George told me she bought the biggest house at the end of the road, an old Victorian with a rusty iron fence, and lived alone since her husband died in a car accident. Here's the kicker. Her husband, a big-shot land dealer, had bought and sold property around Willow Creek, and he was the one who sold the land I'm on to its previous owner. When he died, Margaret blamed outsiders like me, people who came in and bought land without being part of the community she'd built. From then on, she turned her grief into an obsession with control. She joined the HOA right after arriving, and within a few years, Margaret climbed to power by intimidation and manipulation. George said she once fined a family $500 for leaving a bike out too long, then spread rumors about a new couple to drive them out. She called it maintaining order, but to everyone else, it was a witch hunt. Margaret believed Willow Creek was her empire, and me, a guy from Nashville who didn't know her rules, was her biggest threat. She didn't just hate me for using the dirt road, she hated me because I stood for everything she couldn't control. I sat on my porch that night, listening to George finish his story, my coffee gone cold in my hand. "Watch out for her, Ethan," he warned. "Margaret won't stop. She's got money, time, and nothing left to lose." I started feeling her shadow lurking around Willow Creek. I told myself, if I just ignored her and lived quietly on my land, everything would be fine. But Margaret didn't give me that luxury. Just a few days after our first meeting, I got a letter slipped under my door. Stiff handwriting, black ink like a warning from hell. "Mr. Harper," it read, "your truck is parked improperly, obstructing the community path. Move it within 24 hours, or measures will be taken." I looked out at my truck, parked neatly on the red dirt road to my house, and laughed. Community path. This was my private property. I tore up the letter, tossed it in the trash, thinking it was just some bored old lady's prank. But the next morning, I heard a lawnmower roaring outside. Peering through the window, I saw a big guy, sweating buckets, mowing down the wild grass on my land, not 10 yards from my house. I bolted out, yelling, "Hey, what are you doing on my property?" He stopped the mower, scratched his head, and said, "Mrs. Wheeler hired me. She said it's for community aesthetics. This grass is too messy." I stood there, jaw dropped. Aesthetics? This was my land, not her park. I drove straight to Margaret's place, that creaky Victorian, with the rusty iron fence at the end of the road. She opened the door, wearing a silk robe, holding a teacup like she was in some fancy movie. "What's all the fuss about?" she asked, her voice fake sweet. "You hired someone to mow my land without asking," I snapped, pointing back down the road. "It's private property, you've got no right." Margaret sipped her tea, slow as you please, and said, "Your land's in the community area. If you won't keep it tidy, I have to step in. Rules are rules." I clenched my fists, trying not to yell. "Listen up," I said. "This land's mine, this road's mine. You and your lousy HOA have nothing to do with it. Don't touch what's not yours." Margaret gave a faint smile, the kind that gave me chills. "I warned you," she said, her voice dropping low. "If you don't cooperate, I'll take stronger measures. Don't test me, Harper." She slammed the door, leaving me standing there, blood boiling. After Margaret Wheeler had someone mow my land, I decided to let it slide for now, focusing on my new life in Willow Creek. I didn't want her ruining my mood. After all, I came here for peace, not to argue with a drama-obsessed old lady. But then Sarah, my best friend from college in Nashville, called to say she'd visit over the weekend. "I want to see your paradise." She laughed over the phone. I was thrilled. Sarah always brought good vibes, and I needed someone to share Tennessee's fresh air after those tense days. Sarah rolled up Saturday afternoon in her beat-up silver Honda, hair tied high, grinning wide when she saw me by the wooden house. "Oh my God, Ethan. This place is gorgeous," she squealed, hugging me so tight I nearly fell over. We sat on the porch, sipping cold beers, watching the grasslands stretch out under the sunset. I told her about Nashville, the old HOA that drove me nuts, and why I picked Willow Creek. "I wanted freedom, Sarah," I said. "No one telling me how to live anymore." She nodded, but her eyes got serious when I mentioned Margaret. "Wait a sec," Sarah cut in, setting her beer down. "You're saying she had someone mow your land? Is she nuts?" I gave a bitter laugh, recounting the letter and my showdown at Margaret's. Sarah shook her head. "Sounds like those control freaks I dealt with at my old job. Watch out, Ethan. People like that don't quit." I shrugged, telling her I wouldn't let Margaret ruin my dream. But right then, I glanced at the dirt road and saw a familiar figure, Margaret, standing about 50 yards off, clipboard in hand, scribbling something while sneaking looks at my house. Sarah spotted her too, frowning. "That her?" she whispered. I nodded, unease creeping in. Margaret didn't come closer, just stood there, watching like a hawk on the hunt. "What's her deal stalking you like that?" Sarah asked, her tone edged with irritation. I sighed, probably looking for another excuse to mess with me. Sarah looked at me, dead serious. "Ethan, don't let her walk all over you. You left the city for peace, not to get bullied." Margaret finally turned away, but her shadow left a heavy feeling. Sarah stayed till evening, and before driving off, she grabbed my hand. "If she pulls anything else, call me right away." "I'm not kidding." I smiled, nodded, but inside I started to worry. Sarah was right. Margaret wasn't the quitting type, and I wasn't about to let her win. Sarah left Willow Creek that night, leaving me with her warning about Margaret Wheeler. I told myself I wouldn't let her keep me up. After all, I came here to live easy, not stress over some clipboard-wielding old lady. But just 2 days later, I realized Margaret wasn't just lurking like Sarah had seen. She'd upped her game, and I found out the hard way. Monday morning, I went out to the back field to check my new veggie patches. Walking back to the red dirt road, I noticed something odd. A tiny black box stuck on the old oak near my fence, aimed right at my truck. I got closer, touched it, and saw it was a cheap mini security camera, the kind you'd find all over Amazon. My heart pounded. Margaret wasn't just watching me from afar, she was filming me, right on my own land. I yanked it down, wires dangling in my hand, blood rushing to my head. This wasn't a joke anymore, this was a blatant invasion. I jumped in my truck, drove straight to the Willow Creek Community House where the HOA meets monthly. Sure enough, Margaret was there, standing among a group of neighbors, her voice booming like she was running for office. I stormed in, holding the camera up high. "Who put this on my land?" I shouted, eyes locked on Margaret. The room went dead quiet. She turned, face blank, then walked over slow. "That's HOA property," she said, calm as if reading the news. "We need surveillance for community safety. You're a risk, Harper." "A risk?" I snarled, tossing the camera to the floor. "This is my private land, not your park. You've got no right to put this here." Margaret gave that faint smile, the kind that made me want to punch a wall. "You don't get it," she said. "This community has rules. If you won't follow them, we have to act." A few people nodded, but old George, sitting in the corner, shook his head in disgust. I pointed at her. "You just broke the law. I'm not letting this slide." That night, I called Margaret, giving her one last chance. "Take all that junk off my land," I said, voice like steel, "or you'll regret it." She smirked over the phone, her tone dropping low. "You haven't seen anything yet, Harper. Don't test me." The call ended, and I sat there, gripping the phone, realizing Margaret didn't just want control, she wanted war. I looked out at the dirt road, no longer a symbol of freedom but a battlefield she'd targeted. The next day, I found 2 more cameras, one near the chicken coop, the other on an old power pole by the house. I ripped them all down, tossed them in the trash, but the unease grew. Margaret wasn't stopping at words, she was tracking my every move, and that HOA meeting showed she had allies. I remembered Sarah's words, "People like that don't quit." She was right. Margaret was escalating, and I knew I couldn't ignore her anymore. After she declared war, I spent the next day scouring my land, making sure no cheap cameras were left behind. But the following morning, stepping out with coffee in hand, I nearly dropped it. On the red dirt road to my house, just a few feet from my truck, was a gleaming strip of spikes shining in the sun. Not some toy. These were professional spike strips, sharp steel drilled deep into the ground, like the kind cops use to stop fleeing cars. I stood there, blinking, thinking I was dreaming. But no, it was real. A 2-meter line of metal, ready to shred my tires if I drove over it. I knelt, touched the cold spikes, and my blood started boiling. This wasn't petty control anymore. This was sabotage, a threat, illegal as hell. I pulled out my phone, snapping pics from every angle, filming close-ups of each spike, each bolt sunk into the dirt. I needed proof, and I wasn't letting Margaret weasel out of this. I hopped in my truck, drove around through the field to avoid the spikes, and sped to her place. The Victorian loomed ahead, Margaret standing in her yard, coffee in hand, looking at me like she'd expected me. I jumped out, held up my phone, and yelled, "Have you lost your mind? You put spikes on my road." She sipped her coffee, slow as can be, and said, "I warned you, Harper, that road's community property, and you can't use it without HOA permission." I pointed back toward my house. "That's my land, my private property, you've got no rights there." Margaret shrugged, the kind of shrug that made me want to smash her fence. "Rules are rules," she said. "You wouldn't cooperate, so I had to teach you a lesson." Don't like it, sue me. I clenched my fists, holding back from charging at her. This is property damage, I growled. You think you'll get away with this? It's dangerous, and you dared put it on my land. She smirked faintly. Go ahead and fight it, Harper. I've got the whole community behind me. I drove back, head spinning. On the way, I stopped, took more pics, a wide shot showing the spikes smack in the middle of my drive, a close-up highlighting their sharpness. I remembered George's words, she's got nothing to lose, but this time Margaret had gone too far. This wasn't just trespassing, it could hurt anyone, even an ambulance if I needed one. Sitting in my truck, hands shaking, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. She wanted war, fine, I'd show her I wasn't a pushover. Back home, I checked the spikes again. They weren't cheap, someone had drilled them deep, locked them in, clearly planned. I called Sarah, spilling it all. Holy crap, Ethan, she's insane, she yelled. You've got to do something, call the cops, sue her, anything. I nodded, even though she couldn't see. I know, I said, I won't let her win. I hung up, staring at the road that was no longer my free path, but Margaret's challenge. My peaceful dream in Willow Creek was getting trashed, but this time, I'd fight back, and she wouldn't see it coming. She wasn't just crazy, she was dangerous, and I needed someone who could take down her sick control game. Sitting in my wooden house, staring at the pile of photos and videos I'd taken, I grabbed my phone and dialed Daniel Brooks, my college buddy from Nashville, now a sharp lawyer who'd once helped me win a small case against my old company. If anyone could make Margaret pay, it was him. The phone rang twice before Daniel picked up, voice groggy. Ethan, what's up calling me at 8 p.m.? I didn't beat around the bush. Daniel, I need you. Some crazy old lady here just put spikes on my road. Yeah, spike strips, the tire shredding kind. I've got pics, videos, everything. There was a pause, then I heard Daniel burst out laughing. You're kidding me, right? Spikes? She thinks she's the sheriff or something? I sighed. I wish I was kidding. It's Margaret Wheeler, self-proclaimed HOA queen of Willow Creek. I need you to handle this. Daniel stopped laughing, voice turning serious. Send me all the evidence. If you're for real, this isn't just property damage. It's a public hazard, maybe even criminal. I opened my laptop, emailed him the pics and videos, close-ups of the spikes, bolts drilled deep, a wide shot showing them right in the middle of my red dirt road. Minutes later, Daniel called back, buzzing with excitement. Holy crap, Ethan, you hit the jackpot. These are pro-grade, cop-level stuff. She can't deny this. What do you want me to do? Take her down, I said, gripping the phone tight. I want her regretting every second she dared put this on my land. Daniel chuckled darkly. All right, step 1, I'll draft a legal letter demanding she remove it immediately, with a lawsuit warning attached. Step 2, I'll check your land docs with the county, make sure no one can argue it's not yours. If she doesn't budge, I'll take it to court. Property damage, safety threat, I can pile on a few more charges. I nodded, feeling relief for the first time that day. Thanks, Daniel. I knew you were the right call. Daniel kept going, voice brimming with confidence. Listen, Ethan, she thinks she's untouchable, but I've seen her type before, arrogant as hell, thinking the law won't touch her. I'll make her see Willow Creek isn't her playground. I told him about confronting Margaret, how she sipped coffee, dared me to sue, shrugged like she had no fear. Daniel snorted. She just dug her own grave. Don't worry, I've got this. I hung up, sank onto the sofa, staring at the red dirt road now overrun by those spikes. I pictured Margaret getting Daniel's letter. Her tight-lipped smirk would fade fast, but deep down, I was still worried. She had HOA allies, and her sue me taunt echoed in my head. I knew Daniel was good, but Margaret wasn't a pushover. I opened my laptop, replayed the video, checked every frame. I had to make sure it was airtight, no loopholes for her to slip through. That night, I barely slept, dreaming of my truck's tires shredded, Margaret laughing from her porch. But when I woke, an email from Daniel waited. Letters done, sent this morning. Get ready, she won't like it. I smiled. My peaceful dream in Willow Creek was under fire, but this time, I wasn't alone, and Margaret was about to learn she'd picked the wrong guy to mess with. The legal letter went out to Margaret Wheeler that morning, a solid punch demanding she remove the spike strips from my driveway, with a lawsuit threat tacked on if she didn't comply. I sat on my porch, sipping coffee, picturing Margaret's pursed lips as she opened it. Daniel texted me, "She'll have to take it down, or it's court. Don't stress." I trusted him, but deep down, I had my doubts. Margaret wasn't the type to back off easy. That afternoon, I heard a big truck rumble down the main road near my place. Looking out, I saw a black pickup parked by my red dirt road, two guys in work jackets stepping out with tools and cement bags. Margaret stood a few yards off, clipboard in hand, pointing like a construction boss. I frowned, walked out to see what was up. As I got closer, I saw them pulling up the old spike strip. I thought Daniel's letter had worked. But then one guy poured cement, and I realized they weren't stopping. They were reinforcing a new strip, bigger, sharper, right in the middle of my driveway. I froze, mouth dry. The new spikes weren't just drilled in, they were cemented around a permanent trap that wouldn't budge. Margaret turned to me, smirking faintly. "I told you, Harper," she said, voice sugary venom. "Rules are rules. You wouldn't cooperate, so I had to do this." I yelled, "Are you insane? This is my land. You got a lawyer's letter and still pulled this?" She shrugged. "That letter's nothing. Sue me if you dare." I stormed back to the house, hands shaking, grabbing my phone to film it all. Wet cement, gleaming spikes, the two workers, and Margaret standing there, smug as a queen. I snapped a dozen pics, far shots to close-ups, capturing every detail. This wasn't just damage anymore, it was deliberate, a blatant threat, and I knew it'd sink her. I called Daniel, voice cracking with rage. "Daniel," she put the spikes back. Worse, she cemented them in. There was a pause, then Daniel sighed hard. "You're serious? She's nuts. Send me everything now." I emailed the video and pics, hearing him type. "Good God, Ethan, she just threw herself in jail," he said, half stunned, half thrilled. "This isn't just damage, it's intentional endangerment, a flat-out violation after a legal warning. I'll add it to the case, call the local cops too. How far you want to take this?" I gritted my teeth. "All the way, I want her to pay." Daniel chuckled. "Done. I'll file a full lawsuit, property damage, public safety threat, plus willful defiance of a legal order. Cops'll step in soon. Stay cool, I've got it." I hung up, but I couldn't cool off. I stepped outside, staring at the spikes now set like stone, sharp steel jaws pointing up. If my truck hit that, the tires would be toast. If an ambulance needed in, it'd be stuck too. Margaret didn't just want control, she wanted me trapped, isolated, scared. I sat inside, re-watching the video, checking every frame. I pictured her laughing at Daniel's letter, thinking she was invincible. But this time, she'd gone too far. I called Sarah, spilling it all. "Holy crap, Ethan, she's lost it," she shouted. "Call the cops now." I told her Daniel was on it, but I was still a mess inside. Margaret had HOA cronies, and her Willow Creek empire wasn't crumbling easy, but I wasn't weak. I had proof, Daniel, and now a fire pushing me forward. That night I lay on the sofa, staring at the dirt road turned war zone. Margaret thought she'd won, but she didn't know I was ready to hit back harder than ever. I couldn't sit still anymore. The cemented spikes weren't just a threat to my truck, but to anyone needing to reach my house, from Sarah to an ambulance. The next morning, I called Willow Creek's sheriff, Hank Dawson, a guy I'd met at the local store. "Hank," I said, voice urgent, "I need you here now. Someone put spikes on my land, cemented them in." "I've got proof," Hank sighed. "Let me guess, Margaret Wheeler." I nodded, though he couldn't see. "Yep." Hank showed up in 20 minutes, pulling up in his beat-up patrol car, stepping out looking worn. I led him to the red dirt road, pointing at the spikes now solid as rock, cement sealing them tight. "Good Lord," Hank muttered, crouching to look. "This ain't no joke. Who did this?" I held up my phone, played yesterday's video, Margaret directing the two workers pouring cement. Hank shook his head, rubbing his forehead. "I knew she was a pain, but this is nuts. This your land, right?" I nodded, handing him the ownership papers I'd printed from the county. "Private property, not HOAs." Hank stood, voice firming up. "All right, Ethan, I'll handle it. She can't do this on someone else's land. It's property damage, not to mention a public hazard." We drove to Margaret's, Hank behind the wheel, me beside him with my stack of evidence. At her creaky Victorian, She opened the door, silk robe on, tea in hand as usual. "What's all this noise?" she asked, sneering at me. Hank stepped forward, calm but stern. "Mrs. Wheeler, we've got a complaint about you putting a dangerous obstacle on Harper's private property. Care to explain?" Margaret stiffened, then regained her arrogance. "It's a community road," she said. "The HOA has every right to protect residents. He's not following rules, so I acted." I cut in, holding up the papers. "It's my road. County records prove it. Your HOA has no say here." Hank checked the papers, nodded at me, then turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Wheeler, this is private land, not public. Putting spikes like that is illegal, damage, safety threat, and I don't want to hear more excuses. Take it out now, or I'll have to arrest you." Margaret's eyes widened, voice shaky. "Arrest me? You're kidding. I'm just protecting the community." Hank sighed. "You've got 1 hour to remove it. If not, I'm back with a warrant." Margaret fumed, but had no choice. Hank watched as she called the same 2 workers from yesterday, bringing picks and hammers to smash the cement. I stood by, arms crossed, watching her turn red, sweating, barking orders in a fury. Neighbors started gathering, old George quietly watching from afar, a few whispering to each other. "She's been too much for too long," one said. The cement cracked apart, spikes yanked up, and for the first time, I saw Margaret's usual smugness fade, but her glare at me still burned. When it was done, Hank checked the road, nodded at me. "All clear, but Ethan, if she pulls anything else, call me right away." He clapped my shoulder, whispering, "This town's fed up with her. She's running out of allies." I nodded, relief mixing with caution. On the way back I called Daniel, filling him in. "Good," he said. "Cops stepping in's a big win. I'm still suing. This just proves she won't stop." I got home, looked at the red dirt road now clean, but my chest still felt heavy. Margaret lost a round, but I knew she wasn't done. After Sheriff Hank Dawson forced Margaret Wheeler to remove the spike strip from my driveway, I thought I'd scored a small victory. The red dirt road leading to my house was now clear, free of steel blades or cement threatening my truck. Daniel called that night, telling me, "This is a strong hit, Ethan. She'll have to think twice before doing anything else." I laughed, feeling relieved, but deep down I had a hunch. Margaret wasn't the type to give up. Her fiery glare as she took down the spikes said it all. I just hoped she was smart enough to stop. That night, I slept better than usual, dreaming of the peaceful days in Willow Creek I'd longed for. But around 2 a.m., a loud noise, like metal clanging, jolted me awake. I grabbed a flashlight, ran to the porch, heart pounding. My truck was still parked there, untouched, but I felt uneasy. I swept the light around the red dirt road, nothing unusual. Thinking I'd imagined it, I went back in, but the next morning, everything fell apart. I stepped outside, planning to drive to the store, and froze. The driveway was empty. My truck was gone. I blinked, thinking I'd seen wrong, but no, it was really gone. I rushed inside, checked the security camera I'd installed after the spike strip mess. Pulling up the footage, I saw something unbelievable. At 1:47 a.m., Margaret stood by the driveway, arms crossed, smirking wickedly. A private tow truck backed in, hooked my truck, and hauled it off in under 5 minutes. She stared right at the camera before leaving, like she wanted me to know it was her. I sank into a chair, blood rushing to my head. This wasn't just vandalism anymore. This was outright theft. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and called Hank right away. "Hank, my truck got stolen last night, and I've got video of Margaret watching it get towed." Hank sighed over the line. "Good Lord, doesn't she ever stop? I'm coming over." While waiting, I called Daniel, spilling everything. "She did what?" Daniel yelled. "That's grand theft auto, a serious crime. Send me the video now. I'll add it to the lawsuit. She's done for." I emailed the file, then sat there, replaying the footage, each frame burning her smirk into my mind. Hank arrived in 15 minutes, walking in with a grim look. I played the video on my laptop, and he shook his head when he saw Margaret. "She's lost it," Hank said. "Any guess where the truck is?" I nodded. "There's a private lot run by Jimmy Tate, 5 miles from here. I bet she used her HOA connections to stash it there. Hank clapped my shoulder. All right, let's go. We'll get your truck back, and I'll deal with Margaret. We drove to Jimmy's lot, a patch of ground full of old cars and busted tires. My truck sat behind an iron gate, still intact. Jimmy, a big guy in a greasy shirt, stepped out, frowning. "What's up?" Hank spoke up. "This truck was towed illegally from Harper's private land. Who hired you?" Jimmy scratched his head. "Mrs. Wheeler from the HOA said it was parked without permission. I just did the job." I cut in, holding up my phone. "Without permission on my land? I've got video of her watching it get towed. That's theft." Hank turned to Jimmy. "Open the gate, release it, or you'll face accessory charges." Jimmy sighed, muttering something about that crazy old lady, then unlocked the gate. I drove my truck back, but Hank wasn't done. "Now to her place," he said, voice firm. We reached the Victorian, knocked hard. Margaret opened up, still in her silk robe, but her face paled when she saw Hank. "Mrs. Wheeler," Hank said, "we've got video of you watching Harper's truck get towed. That's vehicle theft. A big crime. How do you explain it?" Margaret stammered. "No, it's not theft. It was an HOA action to protect the community." I held up my phone, playing the video in her face. "Protecting the community by towing my truck at midnight? This is my land, not yours." Hank stepped forward. "Mrs. Wheeler, I don't want to escalate this, but you've gone too far. I'll report this, and you better brace yourself, because Harper's lawyer won't go easy." Margaret stood there, mouth opening and closing, the first time I'd seen her speechless. Hank turned to me. "Ethan, keep that evidence. She's not getting out of this." I nodded, giving Margaret one last look before we left. After getting my truck back from Jimmy Tate's lot, Sheriff Hank Dawson and I didn't stop there. Margaret Wheeler had gone too far. Towing my truck in the dead of night wasn't just vandalism, it was blatant theft, and I had the video to prove it. Hank drove the patrol car, me beside him, clutching my phone with that precious footage. "She thinks she's untouchable," Hank muttered, voice thick with frustration. "But this time, she's out of moves." I nodded, dead set on ending the drama Margaret had stirred up on my Willow Creek land. We swung back by Jimmy's lot first, making sure everything was airtight. Jimmy was still there, wiping his hands on his oily shirt, frowning as Hank stepped out. "I need an official statement," Hank said, pulling out a notepad. "Who hired you to tow it?" "Exact time." Jimmy sighed, clearly not wanting to dig deeper. "Mrs. Wheeler called me last night, said there was an illegally parked truck on a community road. I got there at 1:30 a.m., towed it in 10 minutes. She paid cash, stood there watching. I jumped in, holding up my phone. Here video shows her there, smirking as my truck got hauled off." Jimmy glanced at the screen, shook his head. "I didn't know it was private land. She said it was HOA's." Hank wrote it down, voice stern. "You towed a vehicle from private property without legal right. That's aiding theft. Returning it smart, but steer clear of her from now on." Jimmy nodded, grumbling. "I just wanted the cash, not trouble with that crazy old bat." Hank clapped my shoulder. "Let's go, Ethan. Time for Margaret." I climbed into the patrol car, feeling both relieved and tense. Relieved my truck was safe, tense knowing Margaret wouldn't take defeat lying down. We pulled up to Margaret's creaky old Victorian, pounding the door so hard the sound echoed off the rusty iron fence. She opened it, still in her silk robe, but her smug grin vanished when she saw Hank beside me. "Wheeler," Hank said, voice sharp, "we've got proof you watched Harper's truck get towed illegally from his private land. That's vehicle theft, grand theft auto. How do you explain it?" Margaret paled but snapped back fast. "I didn't steal," she yelled. "It was an HOA move to protect the community. He's got no right parking wherever." I held up my phone, playing the video right in her face, her standing by the tow truck, smirking at 1:47 a.m., protecting the community by towing my truck at midnight. I snarled, "This is my land, not yours or your lousy HOA's." Hank stepped up, hand on his cuffs. "Mrs. Wheeler, I warned you yesterday about the spikes. Now you've committed a worse crime. I've got no choice. You're under arrest for vehicle theft." Margaret backed up, eyes wide. "Arrest me? You can't do that. I'll sue. Hank ignored her, reading her Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. As he cuffed her, Margaret spun toward me, screaming, "You'll regret this, Harper. I'll be back." I crossed my arms, watching her get led to the patrol car. "Good luck," I said, voice ice cold. "My lawyer's better than you think." Neighbors started gathering, old George nodding at me from a distance, a few whispering, "She had it coming." Margaret thrashed, red-faced, hair a mess, but Hank shoved her into the back seat, slamming the door. On the way back, Hank turned to me. "Ethan, she'll be locked up till bail if she gets it. Your video's rock solid." Daniel got more. I nodded. "He's suing, vandalism, theft, the works. I want her done for good." Hank gave a thin smile. "This town's been sick of her for years. Now they'll see she's not invincible." I got home, parked my truck on the red dirt road, now calm, but stayed on edge. Margaret's arrest was a big step, but I knew she wouldn't stay quiet in jail. I called Daniel, filling him in. "Awesome," he cheered. "Arrest's a knockout blow. I'll use this to crush her in court." I sat on my porch, staring at the sprawling fields, feeling victory mixed with exhaustion. My peaceful dream in Willow Creek had just been saved, but I knew the cost, and Margaret, even in cuffs, was still a threat not fully gone. Margaret Wheeler getting arrested right at her doorstep was my biggest win since setting foot in Willow Creek. Hank Dawson took her away, and I stood there, watching the patrol car fade out, feeling both relieved and on edge. Daniel called right after, voice buzzing with excitement. "Ethan, her getting cuffed is the final blow. I'll use the truck theft, the spike strips, everything to crush her in court. You ready?" I nodded over the phone. "Ready. I want her to pay for it all. My peaceful dream here had been trashed by her for too long. It was time to end it." A few days later, Margaret got bailed out, but Daniel was prepared. He filed a lawsuit with the Tennessee District Court, charging her with property damage, vehicle theft, and endangering public safety. I sent him all the evidence, spike strip photos, video of her watching my truck get towed, land deeds proving the driveway was mine. Daniel added Hank's arrest report, Jimmy Tate's statement, and even a secret recording I'd made of Margaret admitting she put up the spikes to teach me a lesson. "She's got no way out," Daniel said. "This is the easiest case I've ever had." The trial went down 3 weeks later at the district courthouse in central Tennessee. I wore a neat shirt, sat beside Daniel in the courtroom, watching Margaret walk in with her lawyer, a middle-aged guy looking stressed, clearly knowing he was losing. Margaret didn't have her usual arrogance, hair messy, eyes sunken, but she still shot me a fiery glare. The judge, a stern woman named Miss Carter, banged her gavel to start. Daniel stood, laying out the case like a full story, from Margaret's cameras, to the spike strips, to the midnight tow. I took the stand, recounting it all. How I found the spikes, confronted Margaret, and the moment my truck vanished. Daniel played the video on a big screen, Margaret smirking as the tow truck backed in, then her daring me to sue over the spike strips. The courtroom went dead quiet. Hank testified, confirming the arrest and the illegality of Margaret's actions. Jimmy Tate, though reluctant, admitted she'd hired him without checking ownership. Margaret's lawyer tried to argue it was a Community Protection Act, but Judge Carter cut him off. Protecting the community by stealing a truck and setting dangerous traps. I don't see the logic here. Margaret took the stand, but she crumbled. She stammered, "I just wanted order. He's an outsider, ruining the community." The judge frowned. "Mrs. Wheeler, Mr. Harper has clear legal documents. You had no rights on his land." Daniel landed the final blow, proof Margaret acted after a legal warning, showing intent. After 2 hours of debate, the judge banged her gavel. "I find Mrs. Margaret Wheeler guilty of property damage, vehicle theft, and endangering public safety. She's fined $15,000, ordered to compensate Mr. Harper, and banned from any community organizations for 5 years. Case closed." I exhaled, clapping Daniel's shoulder. Margaret sat there, face pale, her lawyer shaking his head helplessly. Willow Creek neighbors at the trial, old George, the Carters, nodded at me as they left. But the drama wasn't over. A week later, the HOA held an emergency meeting, kicking Margaret out of the council. They issued a statement. "We don't condone Mrs. Wheeler's actions. The HOA wasn't involved in her illegal acts. She lost all power, but the cost was steeper. Legal fees and fines forced her to sell the Victorian to pay up. Old George told me she moved out at night, leaving Willow Creek with her tail between her legs. I became an accidental hero. Neighbors started dropping by, thanking me for ending Margaret's reign. The HOA fell apart soon after, no one wanting to keep that troubled group going. I sat on my porch, looking at the red dirt road, now free of threats, feeling victory tinged with fatigue. Daniel called one last time. "Congrats, Ethan, she's finished. Live easy now." I laughed. "Thanks, Daniel, I owe you big." My peaceful dream in Willow Creek was finally back, but I knew it wasn't free. I'd fought from spike strips to the courtroom to protect it. Margaret was history, but her lessons stuck. I sipped my beer, gazing at the sprawling fields, vowing no one would take this from me again. Margaret Wheeler left Willow Creek, and for the first time since arriving, I felt the air truly lighten. The trial was over, the HOA dissolved, and my red dirt road to the house was free of spike strips or midnight tow trucks. I stood on my wooden porch one weekend afternoon, cold beer in hand, watching the Tennessee sunset stretch over the grasslands. Burning orange melted into green, crickets chirped instead of Margaret's shouts. This was what I dreamed of leaving Nashville for: peace, freedom, no one controlling me. I sat in my wooden chair, opened my laptop and started the first chapter of the book I'd planned for years. Willow Creek's story was now my muse, not just its beauty, but the fight I'd won. I thought of Margaret, her clipboard and wicked smirk, then how she fell to the law and the community. I didn't gloat, just felt relieved. She dug her own grave, and I was just the last one with a shovel. Above all, I realized I was stronger than I'd thought, strong enough to defend this dream. Old George stopped by as the sunset faded, holding a bottle of homemade liquor. "Congrats, Ethan," he said, voice raspy but warm. "You did what the whole town wanted but didn't dare, got rid of her." I smiled, invited him to sit. We sipped the liquor, talked crops and the calm days ahead. He said neighbors were friendlier now, no longer scared of fines for petty stuff. "You changed Willow Creek," he said, patting my shoulder before heading off. I nodded, feeling I'd not only saved my land, but brought something to this place. That night, I walked the red dirt road, flashlight sweeping where the spike strip once sat. Now it was flat earth, grass covering old cement scars. I thought of Nashville, the old HOA that drove me nuts, and saw all the trouble I'd left behind had followed me here through Margaret, but I'd won. Sarah texted, "You good? That nutcase gone for real?" I laughed, replied, "All good, she's done. Visit when you're free." She shot back, "For sure, hero." I went inside, locked up, lay on the sofa staring at the wooden ceiling. My peaceful dream in Willow Creek wasn't easy. I'd battled Margaret from cameras to spike strips to a towed truck to court. But each step taught me, I didn't just reclaim quiet, I reclaimed myself, someone ready to stand for what matters. The last beer was gone. I closed my eyes, hearing the wind through the fields, and smiled. This was my home, and no one could take it again. The story of Ethan Harper and his fight with Margaret Wheeler in Willow Creek, Tennessee, mirrors a reality not uncommon in the U.S. today. The tension between personal freedom and community rules, sometimes twisted by abuse. In America, where private property rights are prized, HOAs often pop up in neighborhoods to keep order, but plenty of times they turn into tools for people like Margaret, folks who wield power to force their will, law be damned. From Margaret planting cameras, setting spike strips, to towing Ethan's truck, the tale shows the clash between Ethan's freedom and Margaret's overreach, a problem still alive in many modern U.S. communities, especially small towns or suburbs. The lesson here isn't just patience or fighting back, it's how to shield your rights smartly and legally in today's America. Ethan didn't go for violence or direct payback when facing spike strips on his red dirt road or his truck getting towed. He snapped photos, shot videos and leaned on Daniel, his lawyer, plus Sheriff Hank Dawson. That reflects a core U.S. value, using the legal system and hard evidence where the law is your shield as a citizen. Real-life advice. When you hit injustice, like Margaret spreading rumors or wrecking stuff, stay calm, gather proof like Ethan with his security cam, and get help from a lawyer or authorities, instead of going lone wolf. Ethan's war also proves community strength. Support from old George and neighbors finally toppled Margaret, reminding us that good ties with folks around you are key to beating trouble. Live true to your values, but don't shy from standing up when crossed, like Ethan did to hold on to his peaceful dream in Willow Creek. Thanks for watching my battle with Margaret to protect my peaceful dream in Willow Creek. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next wild stories. Catch you in the next video, where I'll share more about Tennessee life and lessons from this drama.